And good evening, everybody, and fellow members of the Gallipoli Association. Because Warren, I'm pleased to say that I have joined the Gallipoli Association, as I was a great pleasure to speak at your meeting. And as you and I were discussing before this call, I went to Gallipoli and had a look round for myself, and went diving on a number of the wrecks of the British ships that were lost in the 18th of March naval action in 1915. I also wanted to take a moment just to welcome one of the people who has dialed into this call, and I'm sure I will speak for every member of the Gallipoli Association when I say it's a great pleasure to welcome Josa Keys, who is Roger Keys's granddaughter, who's joining us tonight to listen to this presentation. So Josa has been an inspiration to me, and it's the keeper of the Keys family flame. I think Josa is the way I would put it, and is the daughter of Roger and Eva Keys' second son, who was also called Roger Keys. So welcome, Josa. It's lovely to have you with us this evening. So I've called my talk Roger Keys at Gallipoli, the iron which entered his soul, largely because I think, Roger Keys's amazing life, which is, as Warren said, going to be the subject of my biography of him coming out in November this year. I think Gallipoli and what happened there really was a huge experience for him, which coloured so much of what he then went on to do, both in his naval career and in his political career. And he referred to it in the House of Commons in 1940, as we will discover later in this presentation, as the iron that entered his soul. And I think that that is a phrase that I think is a really good description of just how important this campaign was for him. At Gallipoli, and he has been the subject of my doctorate on naval heroism for the last nearly 5 years at King's College London War Studies Department, where I've been studying under the supervision of Professor Andrew Lambert, who's probably the most distinguished naval historian in the world today. So Roger and Gallipoli have had a lot of intense academic interest over the last few years. So moving on, how and why did Roger Keys find himself at Gallipoli in the first place? That is a really interesting story. He'd actually first visited the Dardanelles when he was the naval attaché in 1906, 1907, based in Rome. And he'd gone up and inspected the Dardanelles Straits at the time when he was working for Prince Louis of Battenberg, who was head of the Naval Intelligence Department at the Admiralty. And in 1910, halfway through the year, I think, he became the inspecting captain of submarines. That was his new job. This was an incredibly important role at a really interesting time, because submarines as a tool of warfare had only really just come into mainstream use. I mean, actually, you can trace the development of submarines back a couple of hundred years. The first ship that was sunk by a submarine actually was sunk in 1864 in the American Civil War, and it was sunk by a Confederate submarine called the Hunley. Unfortunately for the poor people who were in the Hunley, it was the way you used a torpedo in those days was it was attached to the submarine. So the Hunley went and put a torpedo into the USS Housatonic down in Atlanta and sank it, but in the same action sank itself. But by the early 20th century, submarines are really being developed by the French Navy and the Americans. And the British Admiralty places an order for submarines in the early 1900s. And it becomes a new weapon of war. And this is exactly the time that Roger Keys becomes the head of the submarine service. And at the time, the role envisaged for submarines was largely defensive. They were to patrol home waters and to defend harbours. And under Roger Keys's leadership, the submarine service transforms itself from a defensive capability into an offensive capability, and with the development of the new E-class submarine, which has a much longer range. Now, at the Admiralty in 1914, after the outbreak of the First World War, there's a huge row brewing. The reason for the row is that Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, has brought back in October 1914 Admiral Jackie Fisher to be the first Sea Lord. And Jackie Fisher had actually retired in 1910, but he'd been brought out, and he was an inspirational head of the Navy. He pioneered, the HMS Dreadnought, the first big battleship in 1906. And he was a very interesting but very irascible man. And he had his own view of how he wanted to do things. And he clashed continually with the staff at the Admiralty. And one of the people that he took against was Roger Keyes. And the reason why he took against Roger Keyes was actually a really silly reason. It was because he mistook Roger Keyes for a different Keyes who had been press secretary for his absolute nemesis and number one opponent at the Admiralty. He was a naval admiral called Lord Charles Beresford. And Jackie Fisher thought Roger Keyes was actually the Keyes that was associated with Beresford, who'd been leaking information about him that had caused him to have to go early in 1910. So anyway, Fisher hated Roger Keyes, albeit it was a case of mistaken identity. And as a result, he wanted him to have nothing to do with the submarine service at all. Now, at the time, the great defender of Roger Keyes at the Admiralty was the first Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. And he felt, Roger Keyes was one of the most important and offensively minded naval officers Britain has. And you can see the quote down at the bottom of the slide here: a brilliant officer with more knowledge and feeling for war than almost any other naval officer I have ever met. He said in his correspondence to Fisher in December 1914. So you have this big clash. Fisher wants Keyes out of the Admiralty and out of running the submarine service, and Churchill thinks Keyes is absolutely fundamental to Britain's war effort to take the war to the Germans. And so the result of this is that Keyes is instead dispatched to Gallipoli. Now, just before that happened, one of Keyes's submarines, commanded by Lieutenant Norman Holbrook, actually sinks a Turkish pre-dreadnought battleship in the Straits of the Dardanelles called the Medjugorje in December 1914, and Holbrook becomes the first submariner to be awarded the Victoria Cross as one of Keyes's men. So that gives you a little sort of clue and an inkling into how Keyes has transformed the submarine service so that it's now not interested in defending British home waters. It's actually operating as an offensive arm of the Admiralty, sinking Turkish battleships in the Dardanelles Straits. So he has this disagreement with Fisher. He's protected by Churchill. And as a result, the compromise that Churchill reaches with the First Sea Lord is to send him to the Dardanelles, which they've both agreed is to be the new major offensive operation, naval offensive operation that will take place in 1915. And, the reason, there's a lot of discussion about why the Dardanelles started in the first place. As, the reason I think is because the cabinet was utterly frustrated by the lack of progress on the Western Front. 250,000 British soldiers had been killed, going nowhere against chewing barbed wire, as they said, as Churchill said, and they wanted to have a different operation that could knock Turkey out of the war and make progress on a different front. And both Churchill and Fisher were up for that in the beginning of 1915, and they needed to staff the operation. And Keyes was dispatched to the Dardanelles on the 8th of February as the Naval Chief of Staff for the campaign. So he arrives up in the Dardanelles on the 14th of February, in Malta, and he's placed under the command, obviously, of the admiral who's commanding the naval operation, Admiral Carden. And the action to soften up the defences around the Dardanelles Straits begins on the 25th of February. And they have a number of bombardment of the outer forts, which Keyes takes place or takes part in. And on the 5th of March 1915, Queen Elizabeth, which is the only modern battleship that is in the Dardanelles campaign, participates in some of those bombardments. Now, it's interesting to just reflect on the naval aspect of this campaign for a moment, because the fleet that was sent to the Dardanelles, and here you have Roger standing next to de Roebeck, who is the admiral who takes over from Carden, and then Ian Hamilton and General Braithwaite. The reason the fleet that was sent to the Dardanelles was the pre-dreadnought fleet. It was not the main British fleet, the Grand Fleet, which was the battleships under the command of Jellicoe, nor was it the battlecruiser fleet under the command of Beatty. The Grand Fleet is based in Scapa Flow, and the battlecruiser fleet is based in Rosyth. So the fleet that is sent to the Dardanelles is the pre-dreadnought Victorian battle fleet, and the only modern ship that is dispatched to theatre is the new Queen Elizabeth battleship with 13-inch guns, 13.5-inch guns. So, I think it's important to make that distinction. And, Keyes's view on this was, these are our oldest ships. It doesn't matter if we lose some of them. That's what happens in war. And at a time when the army was fighting the war, and losing so many soldiers on the Western Front, the view in the Navy, and certainly the view held by Roger Keyes, was we need to do our bit. And if that means, putting ourselves at risk and in jeopardy, then that's what we're going to do. Now, as you know, just prior to the agreement to having the naval offensive start on the 15th of March, Admiral Carden, who's the original admiral in charge of the operation, places himself on the sick list. Now, I can only think that the reason for this was just the weight of responsibility that they will be trying to force the Dardanelles Straits, taking a battleship fleet made up of British and French ships up the Dardanelles Channel, and facing the bombardment and the coastal artillery from the Turks, and also the potential naval fleet or the naval ships of the Goeben and the Breslau from the Germans as they get through, and the threat of mines going down the middle of the Dardanelles Channel, just was too much of a burden for Carden to bear. And his health fails, and he places himself on the sick list 3 days before the naval operation is due to start. And I think it's also worth remembering that at the point in time, the way the Dardanelles operation was conceived was that it was going to be primarily a naval-led operation, and that the army was only to be used if the naval operation failed to secure its objectives. Now, the objective was to get a fleet through the Straits, get down to Constantinople. And at that point, it was felt that such was the state of unhappiness and political instability in that part of the world that there would be a rebellion in the Balkan area, and Turkey was regarded as the sick man of Europe, and the other states in that area, Greece and the Balkan states, would rebel, and this would cause the collapse of the Turkish government and the appearance of the British fleet off Constantinople, and that would force Turkey effectively out of the war. Now, I have to say, I have got a lot of reservations about that as a naval strategy, because whilst it would have been amazing to take the fleet through, one needs to think about, how would you resupply and revittle and rearm such a fleet when you've got the Turks surrounding it on all sides in the Dardanelles Straits. And I don't think enough thought was given to what would happen then. But anyway, that was the plan. So the command is transferred to de Roebeck, who is the number 2, becomes the number 1. And Rosalind Weems, who becomes a very distinguished naval commander in the First World War and is actually the person who signs the German instrument of surrender for the British in that railway carriage in 1918, becomes his second in command, with Roger Keyes as the chief of the Naval Staff. And so we proceed to the 18th of March, 1915 attack. And the plan was, as I've said, to force the Narrows via the naval attack, and the fleet arriving off Constantinople would trigger a Turkish collapse. But unfortunately, the British had neglected to pay close attention to the activities of a little Turkish minesweeper or mine layer called the Nusrat, which you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture. Now, the actual Nusrat was sunk by the British in the war. So the ship that you can see there is actually a replica of her. But I would say to you, and if any of you have seen this little museum where the Nusrat is there, she is the same to the Turkish people as the HMS Victory is to the British people. This little mine layer is a symbol of Turkish virility and naval supremacy because of what then happened. So on the evening of the 17th of March, the Nusrat goes out and relays the minefield, and it happens to do it in exactly the channel that the British and French ships are going to be sailing up when they enter they start the attempt to force the Straits on the 18th of March. So, the long and the short of it is 3 British and French battleships are sunk, the Bouvet, the Irresistible, and the Ocean, having struck mines, and a further 3, Inflexible, the Suffren, and the Gauloise, are very badly damaged. And you can see in that picture on the left-hand side, that's the Irresistible taking on water, having been struck by a mine, and the ship and the captain and the crew of the ship literally having abandoned it. And Roger Keyes, on the day of the 18th of March, he spends most of his time actually leaving the command, which is in the Queen Elizabeth, and he's out on a number of small ships trying to get onto the Irresistible, which is sinking there, in order to try and tow it, and also onto the Inflexible. So he's actually sort of under fire and trying to take control of these ships that are very badly damaged and sinking, but he's unable to do so. As such, the 18th of March becomes a massive British naval defeat. And if you go there now, you'll see, the local university is called the 18th of March, 1915. It's the name of the university at Çanakkale. And the Nusrat is definitely the Turkish HMS Victory. And the defeat of the Royal Navy, comes as a huge surprise. And it's really seen as a sort of mark of dishonor. And particularly, you have to remember that this is a Royal Navy that is still basking in Nelson's shadow after the victory at Trafalgar for 100 years. And then you get this naval defeat, which has come quite soon after the naval defeat at the end of 1914 in the Coronel Islands, when a British squadron was sunk by a German squadron under the leadership of Admiral Graf Spee. So, it's another depressing result for the Royal Navy. However, this really colours the view of the Navy that it's not possible to take the Straits, and they don't want to risk having another go. And de Roebuck, as the admiral in charge, fears for his career. He thinks he's going to get the blame for this naval defeat. And the defeat chastens both de Roebuck and the British Admiralty. But interestingly enough, it has the opposite effect on Roger Keyes. Roger Keyes views the defeat as, something that is regrettable, but if we have another go, we can absolutely get through. And he writes in his memoirs, in 1934, I had the most indelible impression that we were in the presence of a beaten foe. I thought that he was beaten at 2 p.m. I knew he was beaten at 4 p.m. And at midnight, I knew with still greater certainty he was absolutely beaten. So in Keyes's view, if we'd have pressed on with the naval attack, we would have got through, because the Turks were at, he believed, the end of their ammunition, and that their will to fight had been broken, and that if the Navy had just had the courage to keep going and mount a new attack the next morning, the fleet would have got through. And he remained of that view for the rest of his life, and it became a very important point of view, as we shall see. And so, as a result of what he felt from being, there during the 18th of March 1915, and what he'd actually seen with his own eyes, he repeatedly makes the case to renew the naval assault. And every time he does so, de Roebeck turns him down. He's literally like a Duracell bunny who just keeps saying, we have to have another go. And he will not take no for an answer. So he keeps coming up with plans to renew the naval assault. But as we all know on this call, the Gallipoli now becomes a campaign to be led by the army, and the Navy now is in support of the army. And we have the landings at Cape Helles and then at Silver Bay. Interestingly, two of the submarines, obviously by this time, they're no longer under Keyes' direct command, but they are nevertheless the fighting service that he has, completely re-engineered with the development of the E-class submarine. Two British submarines, the E-14 and the E-11, they actually managed to do what the surface fleet can't do and get through the straits to the other end. And when they're there, they're commanded by Lieutenant Commander Boyle and Lieutenant Commander Naismith. They managed to sink a lot of Turkish ships. So right in the middle of this period, where you have the big naval defeat, you actually have an amazing achievement by British submariners to actually sail all the way through the Turkish defences, through the minefields, onto the other side, and causing mayhem in the Turkish harbours at the other end. So, and both Boyle and Naismith are awarded the Victoria Cross for the sinkings and for their passage. So that's three Victoria Crosses awarded for the activities of British submarines in the Dardanelles. Now, Keyes keeps making his case to renew the naval assault, and a most amazing division of opinion takes place within the British Naval Command during the Gallipoli campaign, because the senior ranking naval admiral, de Roebeck, is categorically against a renewed assault. But by October 1915, Roger Keyes has managed to persuade de Roebeck's deputy, Rosslyn Weems, to support a renewed attack. And Keyes asks de Roebeck for permission to go back to London to make the case directly to the British Admiralty and to the politicians to renew the naval assault. And I think, to his eternal credit, de Roebeck, instead of regarding this as an act of insolence by a junior naval officer to him, actually regards Keyes so highly. He has such a high opinion of Roger Keyes and his indomitable spirit to want to continue the attack, that he allows Keyes to go back to London to make that case, even though he himself is not in favour of it. So I think this is a truly remarkable position for the British Admiralty to find itself in, where you have that split of opinion amongst the senior naval officers in the theatre of war at that time. So Keyes travels back to London, and he visits London in October and November 1915, and he meets with the First Sea Lord, who by this point is Balfour, because Churchill has resigned over the Gallipoli offensive and the resignation of Admiral Fisher in May of 1915. So Churchill's no longer the First Lord of the Admiralty, Balfour is. So Keyes meets with him, and then he meets with the First Sea Lord, Sir Henry Jackson, and he also meets with Lord Hitler, who tells him that he's actually in favour of having another go, but he is concerned that the cabinet is waiting for General Munro's report, and General Munro's report will be the deciding factor for what the British then do at the Dardanelles, and they have to await his recommendations. But Kitchener makes it clear to him that he's in favour of having a go. Balfour looks like he is. Jackson's a bit more sitting on the fence. On the 4th of November, Roger and his wife Eva dine with Winston and Clementine Churchill. And at this point, I think Winston is still in London. I think he's still in the government. But he's not the First Sea Lord, or the First Lord of the Admiralty, rather. And he says, he's very much in favour of them having another go. And he feels sure that the government will agree with the case that Roger Keyes is putting forward. So Keyes then leaves on the 10th of November to return to theatre. The matter has not been decided, but he has made his case, and there certainly seems to be some appetite to give it serious consideration. Eva herself, his wife, is left in London, and she considers seeing several of the senior members of the government to make the case after Roger has departed. And she considers seeing Balfour, Bonar Law, and Edward Carson, who are all senior members of the coalition government. But she's persuaded not to by a chap called Frederick Oliver, who's a senior politician in the Conservative Party and also a specialist in naval affairs. And he tells Eva that unless she can supply operational detail that they do not themselves have, and he very much doubts that she will have that detail, then it's probably best not to go see them. So I find it interesting as a historian that even his wife is prepared to start lobbying these people in Roger Keyes's absence. And that gives you, I think, a little insight into the strength of the relationship between Keyes and his wife, that she would do that. And in the biography that I've written, Eva is a very powerful lady who is definitely the alter ego of her husband and a very, very important part of who Roger Keyes is. But as we all know, the Munro report recommends evacuation, and the British cabinet approves evacuation on the 8th of December. And, they don't therefore agree with having another go for a naval assault. But, that little story of how Keyes turns around the opinion of Wemyss and then is allowed to go and make the case, and all of the people that he saw, I think is a really interesting additional sort of lens on, just how important and how much he believed that the British Navy, the Royal Navy, could actually still force the Straits. Interestingly, he wasn't the only member of his family who was there at Gallipoli. His younger brother, Lieutenant Commander Adrian Keyes, was also at Gallipoli and organised the landings on Y Beach in April 1915. And then after the Y Beach landings, he was then given command of the destroyer Wolverine, which was hunting the German submarines in the area. Now, as we know, the Allies were continually badgered by German submarines, and in fact, the battleship HMS Triumph was sunk on the 25th of May, and there was another British battleship sunk around that time by a German submarine that had managed to get into the rear of where the Royal Navy were having their garrisons and organising their landings. So Adrian was dispatched on the Wolverine to deal with the threat to the British fleet from German submarines. But Keyes's younger sister Phylis also travelled out and went to Murdros between September and late November 1915 to care for the wounded and to help British soldiers in the rest and recreation station that was set up there under, I think, the auspices of Lady Ian Hamilton to care for the wounded. And Phylis gets dysentery, and Roger arranges for her to join the passage home, and she travels home in, I think it's early December, on board the Aquitania, which is transferring wounded soldiers and troops from the Gallipoli theatre back home. So Keyes gets her on the Aquitania, she goes back. Roger himself is part of the team that is supervising the evacuation in January 1916. And he then, when he leaves the beach, having organised the evacuation of the British troops, he then sails with the fleet to Salonika. And in June 1916, he's awarded the DSO for his actions as the Naval Chief of Staff at Gallipoli. And of course, what then happens in Roger Keyes's career becomes the stuff of legend, because he then goes on to become the commander of the Dover Patrol. And it's during his period there that he organises the Zeebrugge and Ostend raids, which I would argue are very significantly impair the ability of the Germans to get U-boats into the English Channel. It's a naval operation that sees the award of 11 Victoria Crosses for the block ships that block the Zeebrugge Bruges Canal. And Keyes is knighted for his military bravery and for leading the Zeebrugge and Ostend raids. And he becomes the British naval hero of the First World War. And he doesn't just become famous in Britain, he becomes internationally famous. And as we will see, that then becomes very, very helpful to a certain politician who needs his help. So Keyes has another visit to the Dardanelles Straits in 1925. And at this point, having been the naval hero of the First World War, he's become the Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff in 1921. And in 1925, he's given command of the most prestigious and powerful command that the Royal Navy can offer an officer, and that is the command of the Mediterranean Fleet based in Malta. And during his time in Malta, which is between 1925 and 1928, he has several occasions to sail through the Dardanelles Straits. And I thought you'd be interested in his quote here from that period, which is, he says then, "My God, it would have been even easier than I thought. We simply couldn't have failed. And because we didn't try, another 1,000,000 lives were thrown away, and the war went on for another 3 years." So, you know, he's never one to change his mind, Roger, when he's decided on something. And he remains firmly of the view that the Royal Navy could have forced the Straits if only the people back in control in London had had the guts, as he says in one of his letters, to fight it out. So you'd be interested in here. This is one of the photographs that Joseph very kindly let me use in the book. Polo is a very big thing in the life of Roger Keyes, and it's also a very big thing if you're in command of the Mediterranean Fleet based in Malta. This is a picture of a polo match actually in 1928, just actually when he comes back from his Malta posting, and Roger is on his court there. He's on the extreme left of the photo. There's another naval officer whose name escapes me in the middle, and then to the right of that naval officer, that is Lord Louis Mountbatten. And the big chap on the horse there, that is Admiral the Earl David Beatty, who is the first Sea Lord at the time. So polo is a very big part of being in Malta and being in the Mediterranean fleet, and it's a big part of the social life of senior naval officers. So he never changes his mind. the Royal Navy could have taken the Straits. He is the hero of the Royal Navy, and he's the choice. He's the hero that wants to become the first Sea Lord. That is the summit of Roger Keyes's ambitions in this world. He wants to become the professional head of the Navy, and he's in 1929. He's the obvious choice to do it. Unfortunately for Roger, the government changes. And in the second half of 1929, a Labour government is elected. And this Labour government have got a very different agenda for the British military, and particularly the Royal Navy. They want to enter into what later becomes the 1930 London Naval Treaty, and that is going to reduce British warship building very significantly in the field of cruiser new cruisers. And it's going to reduce the size of the Royal Navy to 50 cruisers in their fleet. The 1922 Washington Treaty has given America parity with British naval supremacy and has controlled the building of dreadnoughts and dreadnought battleships. But the 1930 Naval Treaty that the Labour government want to pass wants to include cruisers into a similar arrangement to reduce the size of the Royal Navy. And as a result, the Labour government do not, under any circumstance, want to appoint a fighting admiral as the head of the Navy. So they decide to pass over Roger Keyes and they appoint a naval officer who will do exactly what he's told, which is a chap by the name of Sir Frederick Field. And as a result, Roger Keyes, the hero of the Royal Navy, is given the honorary title of an Admiral of the Fleet for keeping quiet and sweeten him, whilst the Labour government prepare for his retirement. And that happens in June 1931 when he hauls down his flag. He's been given the post of commander of the Portsmouth Naval Base, made an Admiral of the Fleet, and then pensioned off in June 1931. So he's now no longer a naval officer. He's a retired Admiral of the Fleet, but he's not done yet. So he is determined to get back into the saddle. And the way in which he decides to do that is he's going to write his naval memoirs. And in the aftermath of the First World War, the writing of memoirs about this amazing conflict that's taken place really sort of sets the publishing industry on fire. You know, lots and lots and lots of people write their memoirs of this titanic struggle that's taken place. And interestingly, it's not just the senior military commanders that are writing their memoirs. It's the citizen sailors, the citizen soldiers, the airmen, lots of people from, I think reflecting the sort of democratization, the extension of the franchise. We've got the enfranchisement of women in 1918. So this provides this immense literary marketplace for people writing their memoirs. And so Roger Keyes has decided he's got an awful lot he wants to say about the First World War. But as a serving naval officer who wants to be the admiral, wants to be the first Sea Lord, he can't say anything in the public domain. But now that they've got rid of him and pensioned him off, now he can have his say. So he decides to write his memoirs. And one of the first people that he tells that he's going to do this is his old friend and previous boss, Winston Churchill. And Churchill jumps on this like straight away. And he arranges for the publisher, his publisher, Thornton Butterworth, to publish Keyes's naval memoirs. Now, what you've got to remember about Winston is that he is primarily, as well as a politician, he's a journalist, and he's also a prodigious writer. And he's written this book about the First World War, which is very vindicating in his position during the Dardanelles campaign, called The World Crisis. And Winston's book has become a bestseller around the world. and his publisher has literally sold millions of copies of The World Crisis. So to have Roger Keyes then get the same publisher is an immense sign of, I think, favoritism towards Keyes by Churchill. And why is he doing it? Well, Churchill actually writes to his publisher and he says, I should very much like to see him, Keyes, write a book which would be to a large extent confirmatory and vindicating of the Dardanelles. So you can see Churchill's absolutely got a motive. He wants Keyes to publish his memoirs and have them serialised. You can see that's the serialisation in the Daily Telegraph in 1934, because he thinks what Roger Keyes is going to say is going to be very helpful to him. And the whole Gallipoli campaign is incredibly important to Churchill, because by the time that Keyes is retiring from the Navy, Churchill has resigned from the shadow cabinet over the India Bill and the plan to give India Dominion status. And he begins what historians call his wilderness years. And if you look at his official biographer, Martin Gilbert, as he says in his book about Gallipoli, what about the Dardanelles was a cry that pursued Winston Churchill on all public platforms for 4 decades. It was the very first question that anybody would ask him at a public meeting, wherever he spoke. And Gilbert goes on to say in volume 5 of the official biography, hatred of him was a flame. No insults were too gross to hurl at him. One, of course, the Dardanelles fiasco, regarded as his particular crime, was always brought up. And in this picture here, you can see Hamilton, Churchill and Keyes in the 1930s together. General Sir Ian Hamilton writes to Churchill after one particular Gallipoli reunion dinner and says that of all the speeches, the most valuable speech of all was that of Roger Keyes. And so Keyes, the importance of what he says in volume 1 of his Naval Memoirs is, it's impossible to overstate it, because this is the validation of a hero. This is, Britain's most famous naval hero from the First World War. And here you can see him in all of his finery and regalia with all his medals pinned to his chest. This was actually on his election address in 1934, this picture. He is the perfect witness, because he's the British naval hero, and he's also the naval chief of staff at the Dardanelles campaign. And what he writes in his Naval Memoirs is exactly what Churchill would want to read. And he says, personally, I think Winston Churchill's name will always be honoured in history for his great strategic effort long after his critics are forgotten. And I believe that this view is accepted now by all who know the facts that I have recorded. So he is absolutely the perfect character witness for Churchill. And, what I've discovered in my researches, which is in the book, is that actually Roger Keyes, when he was writing his naval memoirs, he sent every chapter to Churchill to comment on it as he wrote them. So the two men who were both, out of the saddle, Churchill no longer in frontline politics, on the backbenches, Roger Keyes no longer in the Royal Navy, wondering what he's going to do with the rest of his life. Both men, at this key point in their careers, decide they're going to collaborate together, and Keyes is going to vindicate Churchill's reputation at the Dardanelles, and Winston is going to help Keyes do what he does next. And as you can see here, Churchill makes a huge use of the endorsement that Roger Keyes gives him. And he says, when answering one of the many letters that he gets criticizing him over the Dardanelles, he says, you will see how the harsh judgments of the editor of the Nelson Evening Mail, this is a paper in New Zealand, are overridden by the testimony of the famous admiral. So in other words, Roger Keyes is my character witness. And he says, what I did was absolutely correct. And if there was a failure, it wasn't mine. So that's why it's so important to Churchill. And Keyes continues to defend Churchill over Gallipoli after he enters Parliament. So Roger Keyes stands for the naval constituency of Portsmouth North in February 1934 at a by-election. And Winston Churchill comes down to speak for him. And in 1935, at the general election, he stands again for the constituency, and Winston Churchill helps raise all the money that he requires to from his donor network for Keyes to restand in the seat. Now, this was important because Roger Keyes had devoted his whole life to military service. He wasn't a rich man, and fighting an election campaign was expensive, particularly when he had two to fight within a 12-month period. So Churchill was so friendly towards Keyes and regarded him so highly that he gets his donors to help relieve Keyes of the financial burdens of fighting the second election in a year in 1935. But his most famous speech, I think probably the most important speech delivered in the House of Commons in the first half of the 20th century, was his famous intervention in the Norway debate in 1940, which ended Chamberlain's premiership. But it contained within it a very strong defence of Churchill's actions at Gallipoli. And the reason for that was because Gallipoli was still being used by Churchill's opponents as a reason why he should not be trusted to accede to the premiership in preference to Chamberlain. And Roger Keyes was having none of it. So, and he mentions in that speech the importance of Gallipoli to him. And he says, "The iron of Gallipoli entered into my soul too, for it was a torture to watch the suffering of the men on the Gallipoli Peninsula and their daily losses when I knew it could all be put to an end by bold naval action." And he goes on in that speech to defend Churchill religiously against any criticism by what had happened at Gallipoli. And he says basically Churchill was conspired against by his head of the Navy, Admiral Lord Fisher, and basically the men in the Admiralty had messed up Gallipoli, and they were doing the same now after the debacle of the Norway campaign in April 1940. And so Keyes's defence of Churchill over Gallipoli removed, I think, the last obstacle to him assuming the leadership of Britain at a very perilous time. It was the question that people had about Winston Churchill's suitability to lead the country, and it was Roger Keyes as the Britain's naval hero that enabled Winston Churchill to overcome that obstacle and reduce any concerns people had about the Dardanelles campaign to a manageable proportion. And that speech, I think, was the most important delivered in the chamber of the House of Commons because it changed Britain's leadership at such a pivotal time. If Keyes hadn't have taken on Chamberlain in that debate and then essentially enabled other people to follow that line of attack, then Chamberlain would have survived. And if Chamberlain had been in office when France fell 6 weeks later, then we know that Chamberlain and Halifax would have agreed to the German peace terms. So, without that Keyes speech, which, had a lot to say on Gallipoli, I think the whole history of our country and Europe could have been very different. And, I thought I'd end with this quote, which I think sums up Roger quite nicely, which he sent to Churchill shortly thereafter. Said, I'm told my speech was decisive in helping you get the freedom and power that you needed. Evidently, Chamberlain thinks so as he cuts me dead. So Neville was obviously not happy at all with what Roger Keyes did on that day. But I thought what would be interesting to this audience is to know that actually Gallipoli featured right at the centre of that speech. that he made, because he knew he had to get over that obstacle for Winston Churchill in order to help him become the British Prime Minister. Thank you very much.